Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Tuesday, October 22nd, 2019 edition of the Cluster API Provider Implementers Office Hours. And today it's a special edition. Fabrizio's going to do a deep dive of the new clusterctl. So, yeah, please take it away, Fabrizio.
Okay, start sharing my screen. So this should be. Okay, can you see the screen with the slide?
Yes.
Okay, so really quick introduction. So we are there is the clusterctl design KIB, which is collecting feedback. And today and one of the point of the goal of the KIB is to have to create clusterctl and to expose it as a library. So today I will do a quick walkthrough in the code, trying in the POC code, trying to present the idea of how this API is going to be exposed. So I created this presentation just to use as a canvas to follow, and basically everything starts. clusterctl is a CLI tool. So then we will move to the code. There is the usual CMD folder with Cobra stuff, flags, and all these fancy things. And then there is a package where with a sub package which is called a client, that is the high-level library. And why I call it a high-level library? Because basically the abstraction is really the same that the CLI is proposing. So if in the CLI there is the init command that does a bunch of things, in the high-level library you will find an init command that is exactly the same. And just some detail about how I think we should implement this. That okay, with regard to abstraction, to encapsulation. So this library is going to expose a public interface and a new method that return the default implementation for this interface, and everything else, included the implementation itself, will be private. So we are not exposing too much to the side world, and so which is not dangerous in itself, but it maybe become a problem when you want to change your code. So just to give a quick look in the code, I'm in a fork of the cluster API project under CMD clusterctl. Basically, I reworked this folder, and there is the CMD folder with, as usual, all the commands. I'm slowly working and trying to add a help example and so on, but nothing fancy here. What is interesting is the client, and in the client there is the interface I was talking before, which is the public interface for the client, with the methods that are basically shadow of the CLI interfaces. And then there is the concrete implementation of the interface, which is private, and the user will never get into. So, questions so far?
I do have one question.
Yes.
This is none of this code is designed to be used outside of clusterctl. Is that right?
The library, the idea, one of the goals of the KEP is to expose a library. So eventually, other tool can vendor clusterctl and do the same things without shelling out to the CLI.
I see. If that is the case, I might recommend we're considering an alternative pattern here where we expose the actual underlying struct, because it can be pretty annoying to deal with just the interface. But I think that's probably an implementation detail for later.
Okay, maybe we sync offline with this.
Yeah, that sounds good.
To be honest, with kubadmin we are exposing struct, and at the end we are difficult to manage this, and the code is not so ordered. In kind, they went to exposing struct and they changed it. So there are pros and cons in both the approach.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, so moving on, in what are probably most interesting is that, in my opinion, so in the code there is what I think as a low-level library. In my opinion, we should expose also this one to the end user, but this is open for discussion. And this low-level library is organized around what are the domain entities of our programs, of the problem space covered by clusterctl. And in this case, there are three main entities. One is the configuration, and clusterctl will manage two types of configuration. One is simpler, is the variables that are used for variable replacement, and the other is the repository. So the list of repositories for the cluster API providers, and this is an object. I will give you a quick overview. So it is another package. Again, there is the same pattern, a public interface and a concrete implementation. What is a little bit different than before is that there is behind the implementation, there is another object that is called the reader, which basically reads the config, and by out of the box there will be one implementation that use Viper from reading or from the environment variable or from the config files. And yeah, and having this interface also helps for testing, because everything is easily mocked or faked. Okay, the second object that clusterctl deal with are the repositories, where the provider are deployed. And there are two sub-objects that we deal with in the repositories. One is the component, so the deployments, back rules, and whatever, the YAML for creating the components of the provider. And the second entity are the templates that clusterctl is going to fetch from the repository and use to create the cluster. Again, the code is organized in the same way. What is interesting here is that there will be more implementation of repositories. So let me say, the default repository where we read from is the GitHub release. These providers support also reading from GitHub tree code, so I can go to a specific branch or to a specific commit and read the components from there. And also it will be possible to read from the file system, and and this is useful if you are developing locally and you want to point to your local config file, your local config folder where there are all the components for your provider and test from there. But also it is also a resource for air-gapped environment. And
one question about the remote file system stuff.
yes,
is this different from, or how, I guess how is this different from Customize's remote URL feature? It sounds very similar to me. Reading a GitHub repository from a given commit or tag or branch.
I think that is different because, for instance, one thing that is allowed is to configure the. I will show you. Let me see if we can show. So, okay. I hope it works because it was. Let's see, it works. The sub command config provide. Sorry, I was doing.
That's okay. I'm only asking because I'm doing something very similar, except I was using Customize, and I was curious if there was a use case for implementing some of this stuff that I might have missed.
Yes, there is a use case, and the use case is this one. Let me see, provider, and there is the default. Okay, if you look, you can specify, when you can specify the rule, I support, for instance, specifying latest. Mm-hmm. So there is some logic on top that if you specify latest, basically clusterctl goes fetch the list of release and find the latest one and apply the latest one for you. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, you can pin to a specific release
yep.
in the definition or the provider. So there are currently there are some nuances that are different. Maybe we can try to clean it up and reuse customize clean. I don't know.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's fine. That's fine.
It's something that we can consider. Okay. The last abstraction or object that is managed by clusterctl is the management cluster itself. And inside the management cluster, there are three groups of objects. One is the provider components. The second are the provider objects, and that means the cluster, the infrastructure cluster, the Kubernetes config, so the cluster API objects. And the last one is probably the most interesting one, which are or the newer one, which are the provider metadata that I'm trying. I will try to explain before I give just a quick glance of the code folder. Again, the same pattern with an interface and implemented object. Behind there is this, I call it Kubernetes proxy is basically a proxy that contains the Kubernetes client or the client set, and having this object makes really simple to create tests. And then there are the most interesting part are the objects, so the cluster API objects, and I'm working on creating all the stuff required for pivoting. And Yes, I go back to the last things that I want to talk about and to share, to collect opinion if possible, is about metadata. What is the goal to metadata? So basically, this is an example that I captured earlier today. When I create a cluster, I create this metadata and I keep track of which provider I'm installing in which namespace, the type of provider, the version, and eventually in the future also which namespace the provider is watching. And why I'm doing this? Because I would like that clusterctl will be able to handle what I call advanced use case. That means that are when there are more than the usual 3 providers in the cluster, and there are different combinations. So maybe that I have a cluster with more than 1 bootstrap or infrastructure provider, for instance, AWS, Sphere, and Docker. Or maybe that I have more instances of the same provider. For instance, I have 2 instances of AWS with 2 different credentials, which is another use case for Sphere. There is the same, also for Sphere, there is the same need. And then there is also a different possible combination when you have more version of the same provider. For instance, AWS with 2 different versions. And the other important part is watching namespaces, because I think that I would like to use this information, for instance, to prevent the user deploying provider in a way that the cluster does not work. So I want to warn the user, hey, pay attention, you are deploying 2 provider filed in for the same object, and so on. So this is why, in my opinion, we need metadata. And I don't know if you agree that such kind of information are useful or not. Opinion? Chuck, Jason, David, Daniel?
Yeah, I mean, I'm building something like relatively similar to this. It's much simpler. It doesn't need to take care of a lot of these advanced use cases, but I have something quite similar to the metadata. If this is the data you need, then it's fine, I think. I have no opinion on what it actually needs right now.
So in this case, you're specifically talking about runtime metadata and not necessarily metadata that would describe out-of-tree providers?
I'm talking about metadata that, let me say, attribute of the provider installations.
Okay. Because I think there's the other case of metadata, which is discovery of compatibility of remote providers and all of that fun stuff, which I think is a different use case than what you're describing here.
No, this is a good point. There is still let me say, something that should be addressed in the Cluster API project as a whole. That is the compatibility matrix. When we have the compatibility matrix, I don't know if the compatibility matrix fit in metadata, because this kind of metadata are more designed to describe what is in the cluster, while compatibility matrix is, let me say, an attribute of the provider. But yeah, this is a good point. Honestly, I don't have yet think or deeply discussed with anyone the issue of the compatibility matrix. The best work that there is around for this is one of your issue proposing metadata things for describing the compatibility matrix. Okay, so really the last things that, okay, currently how I implemented metadata. Currently implemented metadata creating an API, so a new CRD under clusterctl, and then the CRD, the controller generates the usual stuff, and I'm applying this in the cluster. This is fine. While this is a POC, probably this is not the best solution in the long term, because, for instance, having a CRD, a separated CRD, goes in a different direction of battery included basically the action that Vince is doing for having a unique deployment of cluster API, and not only for this, but also because clusterctl as a CLI tool is not fit, for instance, for managing conversion webhook around this new CRD. So this is an area where when if the project is green light and then we start moving in the master, we should discuss and find probably a better solution for this for those information. Now I use the CRD because I had a bad experience with the kubeadmin config map. I think that a CRD is more expressive. You can get fancy output like this one, and but this is really open for discussion. And that's all for me.
So I have a question here. Either metadata has a field about their provider status. I don't see it in this example, but I just curious whether it's going to keep track of.
Metadata are basically recording how the provider was deployed. So there is not a concept of status, there is not a concept of controller behind this metadata.
Okay. Yeah, I get that. My thinking is, at least my experience when I deployed those providers, I was curious the status. But it can be, yeah, it can be tracked in other places.
No, this is a good point. One of the idea that when I was thinking about this, I was thinking that the best option for maintaining metadata, this kind of metadata, was the provider to maintain this metadata itself, instead of clusterctl creating and maintaining them. There are pro and cons in this. The cons, the pro is that we can use such metadata in a broader sense. One is to maintain the status of the provider, or to control the provider, tell to a provider, please shut down, please start up. So it is something, it opens up to interesting scenario, but the cons is that basically this requires all the providers to be modified, and that need a lot of agreement and discussion. So this is why in the provider I went, in the POC I went for the easiest way.
I have a question on a different topic. I mean, clusterctl, but is the audience for this like looking at design, looking at the library, the audience seems to be developers writing tools on top of cluster API. So you know, a vendor, let's say, that is, you know, maybe or someone's providing some kind of service for, you know, consuming Kubernetes or managing Kubernetes clusters, but that uses cluster API internally, could take advantage of clusterctl libraries too.
Exactly. The library is targeting the developers who want to manage their own management clusters. Some other question? Stop finish. Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Fabrizio. That was great. Any other topics for today? Going once, going twice. Any other questions? Oh, there's something in the chat. Okay. Everyone is saying thank you to Fabrizio. Last chance for questions. And Fabrizio, do you mind adding, if there are links to some code, or you know, if there's anything available now to look at, it would be great to have those in the agenda doc.
Okay.
And I'll post this recording as soon as I get it uploaded. All right. Thanks, everybody. See you next time.
Thank you.